change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And so what we see here is that there is still a lot of Jews who are all still clinging to the Mosaic Law, which is easy to understand because they've never read the letter to the Romans. Because if you remember, Paul, he just wrote it. It's probably only the Romans who have read that letter, and they've never read the letter to the Galatians, and then there's the letter of the Hebrews, and that letter hasn't been written yet. And all these old customs and traditions, they're hard to change, and they won't change quickly. In fact, they're not going to change until 70 AD, when the temple is actually destroyed, when all traditional Jewish worship ends. But Paul here, he's never told the Jews that it was wrong to practice their customs, as long as when they practice it, they realize it's only ceremonial and it's only memorial. As long as they don't think that their sacrifices makes them any closer to God. But they do have this freedom to observe these holidays and the diets, and they can be a Jew as well as be a Christian in the same exact way that it's by grace that the Gentiles, that they don't have to do these things. And so here it's good to remember, where it's been mentioned in all of Paul's letters, that these legalists, they've been following him from city to city to city, and they're harassing him, and they're always trying to pick off these new believers. So it's not surprising that they're down there in Jerusalem and making all these reports and rumors about Paul. Okay, so now what the elders are saying here is that when these people who had heard these rumors, that they're all coming back, and it's who they call here the assembly. And now when these people, they hear that Paul came to Jerusalem, they're going to want to meet with him. And so now the elders of the Jerusalem church, they're now saying to Paul, well, because these guys are coming, we have a plan. Therefore, do what we tell you. And where one of the people that I listen to regularly, he says that Paul should never do what they tell him to do. Paul should only do what God tells him to do. And a lot of commentators here, they believe what Paul's being asked to do here is a terrible compromise on Paul's part, because this is going to make Paul look like a hypocrite. Because what they're asking Paul to do is to take a vow with 4 other men who are all already going to be taking a vow, or at least for Paul to finance them here in their vow, which means that Paul, he's going to pay all their expenses and pay for all their sacrifices in what looks like here as a Nazirite vow. And what that means that these men, they're going to shave their heads, and they're going to offer that hair that grows on their heads that they vowed for this period, but they're going to offer that hair along with an animal sacrifice. And Paul here, he's going to pay for it all, which is saying that Paul, he actually supports them in this, in that he's in agreement, where it's kind of like he's basically faking outwardly that he is trying to observe the law. And it's just to make peace with these legalists that he's willing to do this. And so this actually almost contradicts everything Paul wrote regarding salvation by grace, where Paul said in all those letters to the Romans that there is no sacrifice to be added that can commend us to God. But I would think that Paul, he's probably really thinking of this more like of what he wrote in 1 Corinthians 9:20, where he says, and to the Jews I became a Jew that I might win Jews. So his motive probably is just to win more people. But by the keeping of the law, that means that there's going to have to be an animal sacrifice that's involved in this offering. And Paul, he absolutely understands that there is no animal sacrifice that plays any part in our atonement. that it's only Jesus' sacrifice on the cross that atones for any of man's sins. So these are probably more of like dedication sacrifices or thanksgiving sacrifices. But even if that is true, this does seem like this is a great compromise just to appease these legalists. And the truth is, it doesn't work. It didn't work. All Paul's efforts here are all wasted. It didn't bring these two sides any closer together. And after the church leaders, they do get Paul to agree to do this, they confirmed that the Gentiles, that they didn't have to keep the law. They confirmed everything that was said at the Jerusalem Council, that the only thing that's required of Gentiles was to keep them things from sacrifice to idols and from blood and from sexual immorality. So here, there's another problem with this, and that's that they're acting like the church is two different groups, that they're two separate groups, that it's made up of Jews and a separate group of Gentiles. But the church isn't two groups. The church is only one group. It's only one body of believers in Christ. But after agreeing to this, the very next day, Paul, he goes with these men to the temple, and he makes this vow with them that's going to last for 7 days. And they almost make it through this whole vow period of 1 week. And some people, they believe that it's actually God who intervened here so that Paul couldn't complete this vow and perform those animal sacrifices. Because just before Paul can complete the vow, Paul is being seen by some Jews from Asia, which means that they're probably from the city of Ephesus, and they're also probably not Christian Jews, where these same men, they have seen Paul in the marketplace with Trophimus, who is Ephesian, but he's also a Gentile. And because they see him together, they assume that Paul has brought his Gentile friend into the temple, which never happened. But that's what they accuse him of. And so these Asian Jews, they start pointing at Paul and they're starting to yell, "He's the one. This is the man. He's the one who teaches every man everywhere against the people, against the law, and against his place." And then they say, "He also brought Greeks into the temple and defiled it." And this is a very serious charge. And what they're saying is that Paul brought Trophimus from the court of the Gentiles into the court of women. And I don't know if you remember this, but the court of the Gentiles, even at Jesus' time, it was made into a marketplace to be able to sell these animals and exchange monies. There was no room for Gentiles in the court of the Gentiles. And that's because the Jews didn't care if Gentiles had a place to worship. But between the court of the Gentiles and the court of women, there was a wall that separated them, where Jewish women, they could go in, but no Gentiles could go. And it was on that wall, it was posted with signs saying, "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the sanctuary and enclosure." And then it says, "And anyone who is caught doing will have himself to blame for his ensuing death." Or these signs, they were posted both in Greek and in Latin, but they weren't written in Hebrew because Gentiles, they don't read Hebrew. And if you remember, Rome, they took away the right of capital punishment away from the Jews. But here, they made it an exception and they allowed it. Where Jews, they could actually even execute a Roman citizen if they went past this barricade. And so this accusation, this caused every Jew in the city to explode. And they all ran into the temple, and this crowd, they seized Paul. And then they dragged Paul out. And you have to remember, there's like 2 million people in Jerusalem, so there's a lot of them around the temple because the temple is the center of everything around Pentecost. And so this crowd, they start beating him, where they're going to beat Paul to death. And the only reason they stopped is because the Roman guard showed up. And they're all coming down from the Antonia Fortress, and the Antonia Fortress was located on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. And at the time of the feast, the Romans would have somewhere around 1,000 soldiers stationed there. And it's because of these large populations at the feast times, and with the strong possibility of having riots. And so these soldiers, they intervene, But it's not because they care anything about Paul, because they don't, but it's all about restoring public order. And then here we see the commander that he sent soldiers, and it says, and centurions, which is plural. And you have to remember, each centurion, they have 100 soldiers with them. And so there's a lot of boots on the ground here. And then the commander commands Paul to be chained with 2 chains, which means that Paul, he's actually chained between 2 soldiers, one on each side of him. And then the commander, he's asking the crowd, hey, what has he done? But he's not getting a straight answer from anyone, where everyone's saying something different. And so he's not quite knowing what to charge Paul with. And so the commander orders Paul to be taken to the barracks. And because of all this violence, Paul's having to be carried up the stairs of the Antonia fortress. So this crowd is yelling, away with this man, away with this man. And so now we have to stop here just for a second, and we have to look at the scene, because at this very same place, about 27 years earlier, right here at the Antonia fortress, this is where Jesus was bound by the Romans as the Jews yelled, away with him, away with him. And now it's Paul who's being carried up these very same stairs, and he sees this crowd. And these are all Jews. These are his people. These are the people that he's wanted to preach Jesus to his whole life since he became a Christian. These are the people where Paul said he would give up his own salvation, where he would be damned if they could be saved. And now he sees this only opportunity to ever speak to these people pass right before his eyes, where this opportunity is about to go away forever. So Paul, he finally speaks up, and he says to the commander, may I speak to you? And the commander, he turns around and amazed, because to this commander, Paul, he just looks like a terrorist. And here, Paul, when he does speak to him, he speaks to the commander in perfect Greek, which means all the phrasing Paul used speaking to the commander. He could tell that Paul was a very educated man. So what Paul would be saying would be something like, pardon me, dear sir, would you mind if I had a word with you? Can you pass the grape upon? And then the commander says, you can speak Greek? And he tells Paul, I thought you were an Egyptian terrorist. Where Paul here, he doesn't sound anything like an Egyptian assassin. And at this time, there was an Egyptian assassin who led 4,000 men to the Mount of Olives, and they declared that they were going to take over the Temple Mount. And the reason we know this is because Josephus, the Jewish historian, that he wrote about it. Where these Romans, they did scatter the Egyptians, but that leader, he escaped. And so that's who this commander thinks that Paul is. And so Paul, seeing his chance go away, he asks this commander to speak to the crowd, where to me, this is very surprising that the commander would say yes. Because as far as this commander is concerned, Paul is the whole reason for this riot. And there's a couple times where I've heard this story about this English minister where he says, everywhere Paul went, he started a riot. Everywhere I go, they serve me tea. But here, this commander, he gives Paul permission to speak to the crowd. And it's not he's allowing Paul to speak, to be able to find out what happened, because he doesn't know what to charge Paul with. He doesn't know what happened. So now Paul here, standing above the crowd because he's on the stairs, he gets his opportunity. And he quiets the crowd by the waving of his hand. And the commander here, he's probably expecting Paul to speak to the crowd in Greek, but he doesn't. Paul here, it says that he spoke to him in the Hebrew language, but he wasn't really speaking Hebrew here. What he actually spoke to them was Aramaic, because the common Jews, they didn't speak Hebrew. It's only the priests and the religiously educated who spoke real Hebrew. So what Paul spoke to this crowd was Aramaic, which was the daily language of the Hebrew people. So the commander here, trying to find out what happened and what to charge Paul with, he doesn't speak Aramaic. So he can't understand a thing that Paul is saying to the people. So now he just has to stand there and wait till Paul finishes. And so now, with the commander's permission, Paul gets his opportunity, and he got all of Israel gathered here in this one place. Now, if this was me, and I had just been beaten, and I was allowed to speak to this crowd, I think the first thing I would do is defend myself, and I would be yelling, hey, I didn't do a thing. I didn't take any Gentiles in the temple. I'm not an Egyptian. You have the wrong man here. But that's not what Paul does. Or maybe you would think that Paul would take this opportunity to do what he's always done, to do what he's done for the last 20 years, what he's been doing in all the synagogues, where he would go and he would take the time to prove from the scriptures, line upon line, the reasons why Jesus is the Messiah, the one we've been looking for. But Paul, he doesn't do that either. But what Paul does here is he gives them his testimony, and he tells this crowd how he came to Christ. So Paul, he begins this by calling them his family, and he calls them brethren and fathers. So he's identifying himself as a Jew. And then Paul says he's making his defense, and he uses that word apologia or apologia, where we get our word apology or apologetics. And then them hearing Paul speak in Aramaic, they even become even more quiet, and they start to listen carefully as Paul, he gives them his credentials, where he tells them that he's a native of Tarsus, but he's really a Jew, that he was brought up in Jerusalem. And so he's telling them, I'm not an outsider. I'm Jewish. I was raised here. I was trained by Gamaliel. And Gamaliel, he was the greatest of all the Jewish teachers. And not only just at their time, he's still that today. And even in this large crowd that Paul's speaking to, there would maybe only be a handful of people who would be able to make that kind of a claim to be taught by Gamaliel. And then he tells the crowd how much of a zealous Jew he really was toward God, where he admits here, he admits, I have killed people. I have bound and arrested them, even women. All these people who call themselves the Way, the Christians. And we're not going to go into detail over Paul's testimony today. We've already been through this once, and we're going to repeat it again in the next couple of weeks, because he's going to say the same things to Felix and King Agrippa. But this Jewish crowd here, they're all listening intently to Paul's testimony and the story of his conversion, about this miraculous occasion of how Jesus appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus, where Paul heard his voice and saw Jesus' glory, where Jesus is still alive, because Paul had believed that Jesus was dead and that his body was stolen by the disciples, because that was the rumor that was spread to all the Jews. And there's a lot of Jews here that are standing here that believe the same thing. And this is the reason why Paul had persecuted the church. And so then Paul, he goes on and he talks about his blindness and about Ananias praying for him, and Ananias' prophecy of how God had chosen Paul to see and hear the just one, which is just another name for the Messiah, where Ananias prays for Paul, and he tells him, for you will be his witness to all men. But these people listening to Paul, they don't really understand what God is saying to Paul here, that Paul will be a witness to all men. And then Paul, he goes on and he tells him about his baptism, and then Paul tells him about this second vision of Jesus, where Jesus appeared to Paul, which happened about 2 to 3 years after Paul had become a Christian. And this vision that Paul had, it occurred in the temple, which would be showing these people that although he was a Christian, he was still a Jew because he's in the temple. And this is the only place that we ever hear about this second vision of Paul's, where he saw Jesus. Paul, he never mentions this vision in any of his letters. So there really is a lot about Paul's life that we don't know. And you would think that this crowd, they would have turned on Paul at the mention of the name of Jesus, about Jesus being Messiah, the Christ. But they didn't. That didn't bother them at all. And then Paul tells them that Jesus tells him to make haste to get out of Jerusalem because the Jews won't receive your testimony concerning me. And this is that place that we talked about where Paul, he argued with Jesus that he was really the guy to speak to the Jews, that the Jews, they're going to listen to me because he thinks that by persecuting Christians, that'll give him credibility with the Jews. But even Paul talking about this, that didn't bother the crowd. They were open to hearing about Jesus. But it's the very next line that they couldn't take when Paul tells the crowd what Jesus told him next, where Jesus said to Paul, "Depart, for I will send you to the Gentiles." Where it's just that mention of the word Gentiles, it was like a bomb went off. And now the crowd blows up and they're shouting, "Away with such a fellow from the earth," which is basically, kill that man. And now this second riot breaks out. And now all the crowd, they're tearing off their clothes, they're throwing dirt in the air, because this Jewish crowd, they can't believe that God would want to save Gentiles, because no devout Jew would have anything to do with a Gentile. Where the Jews, they really weren't against Gentiles becoming Jews, but they had a really hard time with Gentiles being equally loved by God. And this commander here, he didn't understand a word that Paul said. And so now this second riot's breaking out. And so he orders Paul to be brought into the barricade to be examined by scourging so he can find out what really happened. And scourging is a lot different than just being whipped or beaten by rods, because scourging can cripple you for life, where people, they die from scourging. But scourging was common, but it wasn't common for a Roman citizen. And then it says they bound Paul with thongs, which means they tied Paul's hands with these leather straps, which means they tied them around a wooden pole where they have his back exposed, ready to be scourged. And Paul, he wouldn't be released until he confessed his crimes. And it's not until this point where Paul announces his Roman citizenship, where he has rights, where his rights here have already been violated by him being bound, where Paul says, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who's a Roman and uncondemned?" Where, by the way Paul looked here, he didn't look like anyone who would ever be able to afford a Roman citizenship. And most Jews, they weren't Roman citizens. And so Paul here, he also didn't have an Italian accent. And so after the commander found out that Paul was a citizen, he became afraid because he had already violated Paul's rights. And this is where we're going to leave off till next week. But what I do think we should take away from this is the power of a testimony, where everyone in Christ, they have a testimony, just like Paul here, of who you were before Christ and how Jesus made himself known to you. How did you receive him? When you believed and you confessed him as Lord. And then everybody has your life after Christ, how you changed. And I tell you, hearing people's testimonies, it never gets old to see what God does in the life of people. Now, if you don't have a testimony, because you don't know Christ in this way, you need to have a testimony where you have your life that you've had before Christ. And then you finish that testimony by seeing how God changes you. And there's no one who's ever come to Christ who has ever regretted it.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,